that really sort of won me over pretty quickly. But then it takes another turn, right? And so not only how does a cardiologist become the medical director for Metabolic Mind, but how does a cardiologist who did his fellowship in an Ornish style, fellowship preventive program now become a low carb and ketogenic advocate? And so that's really the turn. And
you're speaking Dean Ornish.
Correct.
A lot of people may not know who that is.
Oh, okay, so good point. So he is one of the biggest medical vegan advocates that, any ounce of fat in the diet is going to kill you. Obviously, that's a overstatement, but that's not much of an overstatement. And so he's been an advocate of and he's a cardiologist. So he has established a preventive cardiology program that includes a vegan diet. But here's the thing, we ran this program, and it was all about getting people to stop smoking, getting them to start exercising, getting them to utilize stress management, building a community of individuals. And people love that stuff. And then there was the vegan diet part, which, they sort of tolerated to be part of this program. And people did well in the program, but the problem is when you say, see, look, the vegan diet is what's helping these people. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of, whether it's Dean Ornish himself or the media surrounding his programs, tends to portray it as. But really, it's multifaceted. They're getting more attention. They're getting more hand-holding. They're getting better medical treatment. And they're getting stress management, exercise, community support. So anyway, so I love that part.
And so where were you at that time, in your own opinion? Like, for example, if I were to have talked to Bret Scher, dare I ask, what time this was, roughly?
2000, 2001.
2001?
Is that right? Yeah, somewhere around there.
So let's say I approach Bret Scher. You're in residency by this point?
This was fellowship.
Fellowship, okay. So I talked to fellow Bret Scher, and I go, I'm curious, how much of each of these things you just mentioned, ceasing smoking, getting more exercise, how much specifically does the plant-based diet matter for heart health, given your best estimate? Because I have to be honest, Doc, I'm not so sure if I'm as interested in a plant-predominant diet. What would you have said then?
I would have said it's crucial. Yeah, I would have said it is the key. And that's just the way we're taught, right? And it's the diet that helps lower LDL. Full stop. Don't need to consider anything else,
So if I'd said then, okay, well, I've got a diet, it's not plant predominant, but it does keep my LDL down. Would that be okay?
Interesting. I mean, I think I would have been interested in it, but still there's the lore of the vegan diet, the low-fat diet, that in itself, by definition, is beneficial for cardiovascular disease. And I want to kick myself now for even admitting that that's what I thought. But that's, it's when you're a resident or a fellow or a student, you're very impressionable, right? Like you're learning from these luminaries in your field who are the experts, who've been doing this for decades, who write the papers, who do the research, who write the guidelines. That's exactly who you want to learn from, or at least who you think you want to learn from at that moment. I've got no experience, right? And unfortunately, the critical thinking part is not, or certainly was not, as valued, I would say. Here's an aside. I remember as a chief resident, so this was right before fellowship, one of the interns, so very beginning, just out of medical school, came up to me and we were talking about when to replace a heart valve for aortic stenosis. And the guidelines were, if you're not symptomatic, you don't replace it. And he's saying, well, why not? Like, you're healthier, you're younger, and it's going to get to that point. Why don't you replace it now before you get sick? And I was just like, I don't want to hear it. I was like, no, the guidelines say this. Fast forward to now, they're replacing it much earlier now than they were back then. Techniques are a little bit different, and the philosophy is changing. So that's the perfect example. I wanted to shut down his critical thinking because it was against the guidelines. Now the guidelines have changed because of people doing critical thinking. And so we need to, I'm going off on a tangent here, but we need to.
That's what this is for. Tangent away.
Yeah, we need to build that up. And so I don't think we do that nearly enough. In fact, frequently we sort of bat it down. And so I was at a point where I wasn't, analyzing things critically. I was trying to be a sponge and soak everything up from around me. So that was the low-fat vegan diet as being the diet for heart health.
Well, I do want to entertain your tangent for a second, because guidelines are, I think, arguably very well-intentioned. It's meant to be a streamlining, if you will, of experts in the field to try to help clinicians so that they don't have to work as hard at doing the research, the hard work that they've done to make it in a more digestible form so that they can then pass it on to the care of their patients. But you zeroed in on what is also a bit of a problem, right? Because we want that so much because we'd like to not have to think about things. Would that be a fair way of describing it?
Yeah. I mean, it's easier to practice medicine in a cookbook, follow the guidelines. It tells you what to do type of pattern. It's exhausting to have to critically think and do a deep dive into every patient, every situation, every encounter. It's a lot easier to check, and move on. And that allows you to see more patients, to help more people. It allows your hospital practice or your medical practice to survive and do better. And, it's a win-win, right? Until you talk about the personalization of care, and now you're treating one person like everybody else, and to do those guidelines and that data actually apply to them, and what is the quality of it, right? All these layers that is much easier not to go into. But once you see those layers, it's like, wow, how could we have ignored them? Because those are such critical layers for you, the one individual I'm talking to right now as my patient.
There's also kind of an implicit assumption, I think, that all of us have with guidelines or institutions, which is if there's a change to be made, it's going to happen. That if there's a change in how the field is thinking of something, that we should see that develop in the guidelines quickly.
Quickly?
Well, that's what we would hope, right?
Yeah, that's what we would hope, but it does not happen. I mean, it is painfully slow. You can quote like it takes 17 years for practice to change. I've heard the fastest is like 7 years, but the average is 17 years or something like that. I forget the exact numbers, but it's painfully slow either way. And the old saying that practice changes, policy changes one death at a time, because people make their whole careers about a certain area of research and a certain stance, and they work their way up to be in charge. And it's hard to change your mind and to admit you were wrong and that the work you had done for decades, there's a better way or a different way to do it. That's hard to do. I acknowledge that. But it still needs to be done so often. And I think the groupthink mentality, the way it's always been, the dogma, there's a lot of power to that. And that's a problem that we're facing in medicine.
So let's go back to the timeline. This is early 2000s.
Yeah.
You're fully on board with what would arguably be the standard of care.
Sure.
Guideline supported.
Sure.
When did you start changing gears?
Well, so in fellowship, you're in a very sort of protected environment still, right? The patients, they're not really my patients. I'm not following them for a long period of time. It's a 3-year fellowship. So the longest you could follow anybody is 3 years. But even within that framework, it's usually much shorter. And you're rotating around among the different rotations. You're doing time in the cath lab and whatever. So it wasn't until I got out of the fellowship into my own practice. Now they're quote unquote my patients. I'm more responsible for their outcomes and their care, and I'm going to see them over the long run. And you see like the effect that you're having on people is not minimal. Like, look, and don't get me wrong, cardiology can do amazing things. If I'm having a heart attack, I need my heart valve replaced, or I'm in severe heart failure, there is no place I would rather be than in a U.S. hospital having, the well-trained cardiologists take care of me with the medications and the devices that we have for those extreme circumstances. But when it comes to, well, how about we can do our best to make sure you don't need those, and that you can get healthy and you can reverse conditions and you can, improve your quality of life without having to get to that extreme. That's where we're not so good. And that was the realization that I had. So first, that patients weren't getting better as quickly or as drastically as I hoped they would. But two, nobody, and I mean almost nobody, quote unquote, complied with lifestyle recommendations. The recommendations being reduce your fat, reduce your calories, exercise more. Standard of care, supported up and down by the guidelines. And people don't want to do it. They just, let me rephrase that. Not that they don't want to do it. It's that it's really hard to do. It's, people don't enjoy it. People get cravings. People get hungry. People get emotional. And they just sort of give up. They don't have the support that they would need to do it. And then in the long run, it just doesn't work for them. So they come back and what do? You check the box that, advised on lifestyle unsuccessful or non-compliant with lifestyle. And then you move on to the drugs. And it was this circular component that just kept happening. And I said, there's gotta be a better way. It's that old analogy. If you're teaching a class and one kid fails and everybody else passes, you're probably doing a good job. But if 90 kids fail and 2 kids pass, it's not the kid's fault. That's when you got to look internal. So that was sort of the reckoning I had when all of a sudden it was, lifestyle wasn't working, diet wasn't working, exercise wasn't working. It's like, maybe it's not them. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's the recommendations. And maybe there's a better way to do it.